World War II. World War II was not a conflict of soldiers, it was the industrialization of extinction. While previous wars sought territory, this was a global factory of death designed to erase entire ethnicities and ideologies from existence. The unique factor here was the birth of the atomic age, the moment humanity developed the power to commit planetary suicide. Statistically, it remains the darkest stain on our species, with a staggering death toll reaching 85 million lives. It saw the systematic murder of millions in death camps and the total incineration of cities like Dresden and Hiroshima. The fatal flaw was the Axis delusional logistics. They built a war machine fueled by fanatical hatred that simply could not outproduce the infinite industrial resources of the Allies. It proved that in the modern age, victory isn't won by the bravest warrior, but by the most efficient killing machine. The war didn't just end, it shattered the old world order forever, leaving a planet permanently haunted by the shadow of the mushroom cloud. Mongol conquests. The Mongols were history's ultimate reset button. They didn't just conquer civilizations, they liquidated them. The unique factor is the sheer environmental impact. Genghis Khan's hordes killed so many people that massive areas of farmland returned to forest, scrubbing so much carbon from the atmosphere that the entire planet actually cooled down. This was a biological purge. With a death toll of 40 million, the Mongols systematically erased the Islamic Golden Age, turning the Tigris River black with the ink of destroyed libraries. The fatal flaw was the empire's reliance on a single, godlike patriarch. Once Genghis was gone, the machine had no brain, eventually fracturing into rival khanates that ate themselves from within. They proved that terror is the most effective tool for conquest, but it is a hollow foundation for a lasting civilization. The Mongols didn't just change history, they paused it, leaving behind a silence that lasted for generations. World War I. The Great War was the moment the 19th century aristocratic dream collided head-on with the 20th century nightmare, and neither survived the impact. It was a mass suicide of the Western elite, dressed up as honor and glory. Four empires, German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, collapsed simultaneously, as if history had decided to settle every debt at once. In just 4 years, 20 million people were fed into an industrialized slaughterhouse of chemical gas and machine guns. This wasn't war, it was a laboratory of agony carved into the mud of stagnant trenches that didn't move for years. Generals commanded Napoleonic tactics against weapons born from the Industrial Revolution, sending an entire generation of young men into the mouth of a machine they had no answer for. Technology had officially outpaced human morality. The war ended not with victory, but with a global wound so deep it birthed the most violent ideologies of the following century. The war to end all wars didn't end anything. It only guaranteed the next one would be far more devastating. Taiping Rebellion. A single delusion can be more lethal than an atomic bomb. The Taiping Rebellion is the proof, led by a man who genuinely believed and convinced tens of millions of others that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This civil war nearly erased China from the map. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Between 20 and 30 million people were slaughtered or starved to death in a fanatical crusade for a heavenly kingdom. More deaths than the entirety of World War I, caused by one man's messianic delusion. The fatal flaw was internal paranoia and the mental disintegration of its leadership, which opened the door for Western powers to intervene and prop up the dying Qing dynasty as a puppet state, all while the country bled out from within. It proved that when religious zealotry is weaponized by the desperate, the carnage can threaten the survival of an entire civilization. The rebellion didn't just weaken China, it broke its spirit, leaving the gates open for a century of humiliation. Three Kingdoms War. After the Han Dynasty collapsed, China didn't just enter a period of political instability, it entered 60 years of absolute carnage, a slow-motion extinction event for one of the world's greatest civilizations. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In just 6 decades, the population plummeted from 50 million to a mere 16 million. This wasn't a war. It was the systematic murder of a civilization. Agriculture abandoned, law dissolved, human life reduced to a liability. The fatal flaw was the hubris of regional warlords, each convinced they alone deserved the throne, none possessing either the legitimacy or the restraint to stop the cycle of betrayal before it hollowed out the nation entirely. Once the central pillars fall, the vacuum consumes everything. The stories from this era were so horrific they had to be mythologized for 1,000 years just to make the horror digestible. It was the murder of classical China, and it left behind one inescapable lesson. A civilization's greatest enemy is never the invader at the gates, It is always the ambition rotting it from within. Rome's fall. The fall of Rome was not an event. It was a century-long murder-suicide, slow, deliberate, and entirely self-inflicted. When the Western Empire finally collapsed, it didn't just lose territory. It lost the knowledge of how to build. The secrets of concrete, complex engineering, and international law vanished from Europe for a millennium. Entire systems of thought, legal, architectural, civic, were simply erased. The death toll is unquantifiable because what died wasn't just people. It was the concept of civilization itself, the lethal cocktail of hyperinflation, systemic corruption, and a military that had become a collection of barbarian mercenaries with no loyalty to the state they were paid to protect. When the money stopped, the soldiers became the looters. The walls held, the institutions didn't. Rome proved that a superpower doesn't fall when its borders are breached. It falls when its internal systems stop functioning. And once they do, the darkness that follows can last centuries. 30 Years' War. What began as a religious dispute between Protestant and Catholic princes ended as something far darker, a geopolitical game of total annihilation that turned Central Europe into a literal graveyard. In parts of modern-day Germany, up to 60% of the population was erased. Not defeated, erased. Mercenary armies moved through the land like locusts, burning crops and spreading plague as a deliberate strategic maneuver. Starvation and disease became weapons of war. Civilians became the primary casualties, not by accident, but by design. They refused to acknowledge a changing world, choosing instead to cling to a dying order while their subjects paid the price in blood. This was the arrogance of power, the absolute refusal of the ruling elite to accept that their era of religious hegemony was over. The conflict only ended when the survivors were too exhausted and too few to keep fighting. The Treaty of Westphalia was born from that exhaustion, and with it, the modern nation-state. But the price of that political evolution was the near extinction of an entire society. An Lushan Rebellion. At the peak of the Tang dynasty, the most sophisticated civilization on earth, a single rebel general pulled the thread that unraveled the world. The An Lushan Rebellion was the systematic execution of a golden age. The census data reveals a horror beyond comprehension. The population plummeted from 53 million to barely 17 million in less than a decade. We are talking about 36 million lives erased, nearly 15% of the entire human race at the time. The Silk Road, the world's economic heart, stopped beating. The era of great poetry was literally drowned in blood. They refused to acknowledge the rot, blinded by their own luxury, while provincial warlords siphoned the state's monopoly on violence. The emperor chose poetry over power, ignoring the growing shadow of treachery until the very generals he subsidized were marching on the palace gates with blades drawn. A superpower without a rival became a graveyard in a single generation. When a civilization surrenders its strength for comfort, the fall is never a slope, it is a cliff.